Starting in the heart of New York City, often called the city that never sleeps, is a swirling mosaic of ambition, skyscrapers, and endless energy. On the east side of Manhattan, in the busy Midtown district just a few blocks from Central Park, stands the imposing Brookwood Tower. This 22-story office building is a hub for countless businesses, tech startups overlooking their next big launch, old law firms with walls lined by mahogany and decades of secrets, bustling marketing agencies and innovative fashion design studios. Thousands flood into this building every morning, emerging from the clatter of the subway or shielding lattes from the wind that cuts through the avenues. Brookwood Tower is more than just steel, glass, and an address on East 54th Street. It's a character in itself, an urban epicenter of aspirations, late-night strategy calls, and even occasional heartbreak. Its lobby is alive at all hours, with the aroma of coffee, the muffled heels of executives on polished floors, and the hum of conversation echoing upward. Office workers rub shoulders with janitors on early morning rounds, and security guards give a familiar nod to regulars and strangers alike. The city outside is relentless, but inside a strange sense of camaraderie can form. Over brown bag lunches and elevator rides, alliances are forged, rivalries bubble, and lives unfold behind the mirrored glass. Yet beneath this glossy facade of corporate hustle, Brookwood Tower holds its secrets. Old maintenance tunnels snake beneath the building, sometimes explored by workers on a dare. Some sections have been shut off for years, and rumors persist among staff about what really happened during the blackout of '86, or why that one office remains locked and untouched. The janitor, a kind-faced man named Robert who swept for decades, warns newcomers not to poke around after hours. It was this odd mix of anonymity and intimacy, ambition and secrecy, that created the perfect breeding ground for the city's looming nightmare. No one, as they queued for coffee or shuffled paperwork under fluorescent lights, could have foreseen the gruesome events that would soon shatter the Brookwood routine and bring national headlines to a building once known only to its tenants and the mailman. On an unremarkable winter's day in February 1999, the city's pulse seemed as steady as ever, but the dark ripple about to disturb its heart had already begun, lurking in corners, waiting for the right moment. A fateful morning. Monday, February 22nd, 1999. The city was sluggishly shaking off the haze of a long weekend as people returned to work after President's Day. In Midtown Manhattan, the imposing outline of Brookwood Tower sliced through a pale gray morning sky, its glass facade still streaked with the remnants of last night's rain. Most companies in the building had yet to turn on their lights. Just a handful of early risers dotted the lobby, clutching their coffee with slightly more desperation than usual. Some offices were still locked and silent, their blinds down tight, while others glowed with tired anticipation of a new week. Frank Howard, the morning shift security guard, made his rounds with a practiced nonchalance born from years of routine. With most tenants still absent and the cleaning crews already done with their night's work, he actually enjoyed the rare hush that filled the long halls, echoes of his own footsteps bouncing off marble and glass. That morning he chatted briefly with Janine, the barista at the ground floor cafe, rolling his eyes about the midwinter chill that seemed to seep into every bone. By the time the elevator dinged open on the 17th floor, Frank expected nothing out of the ordinary, but sometimes fate picks the most unremarkable of moments to turn everything upside down. As Frank walked his post along the corridor, a sharp metallic odor hung in the air, odd, insistent, impossible to ignore. He paused, scanning for signs of cleaning or construction. The area was under partial renovation, with a portion walled off by temporary partitions and plastic sheeting, half obscured under dim emergency lighting. Figuring he'd find a burst pipe or more likely that a small animal had died back there, he reluctantly approached the construction zone, his flashlight darting against drywall and exposed piping. He traced the smell to the far end of the hall, toward a restroom temporarily being used by contractors. Hesitating only a second, Frank pushed open the swinging door. The light flickered overhead and his boots echoed on the linoleum. At first he didn't notice anything amiss, the usual mess, scattered mop buckets, rolls of heavy-duty paper towels. Then his gaze dropped below the sink, where a large white canvas bag was crumpled against the tiles. The smell was overwhelming now, acrid and unmistakable. With gloved hands, Frank nudged the bag, half expecting to find construction debris or at worst a dead rat. Instead he felt something eerily soft yielding inside the canvas. Dread flooded him. Ignoring the urge to bolt, he carefully opened the bag, and froze. Inside, obscured by rags and plastic, were fragmented parts of what, now all too clearly, was a human body, cut and packed in a way that made Frank recoil in terror. He staggered back, clutching the stall for support, vision tunneling as the shock set in. His mind scrambled to make sense of the scene. This could not be real, not here, not now. For a moment the world narrowed to that tiny, squalid space, and the sickly stench of death. When Frank finally snapped out of his panic, years of security training kicked in. With shaking fingers he radioed the building manager, then dialed 911. He locked down the floor, eyes wide and heart careening in his chest, his thoughts churning. Who could have done this? How did it happen, right under everyone's nose? Within minutes, the lobby was awash in blue and red strobes as the NYPD secured Brookwood Tower. Yellow tape went up around the entrance. Seasoned homicide detectives strode past stunned employees, their shoes squeaking on newly polished marble. Frank was led away for questioning, still pale and trembling, his routine blown apart by the sudden swirl of chaos and suspicion. The building's heartbeat, so steady just minutes ago, now pounded with fear and whispered speculation. The city outside hurried on, unaware that inside Brookwood Tower, a tragedy had just rewritten the destinies of everyone involved. Horrifying discovery. Frank paused for a moment in the dimly lit restroom, his senses overwhelmed by the putrid smell that seemed to have gathered all its strength in this tiny windowless space. He was no stranger to unpleasant discoveries, abandoned lunches, a broken ceiling tile, even a raccoon once in the basement, but nothing in his years of walking these corridors had prepared him for what he was about to see. The buzzing fluorescent light overhead flickered as he crouched hesitantly, his gloves trembling slightly as he reached beneath the sink. The canvas bag was out of place in an area used by construction crews, too clean, too ordinary, like someone had wanted it to blend in until they could come back for it. With a gentle nudge, the bag yielded, its weight shifting oddly within. Every instinct screamed at Frank to turn away, but curiosity and duty forced him on. Carefully he pulled the drawstring back. What met his eyes was the stuff of nightmares. Inside the bag were human remains, cruelly packed among rags and torn sheets of plastic. The sight was so surreal, so stark, that his brain failed to process the details at first. He registered pale skin, what might have once been an arm or part of a torso, but the jumble of angles and the metallic sweet tang of fresh blood were unmistakable. For a split second, time stopped. Frank heard only the rush of blood in his ears and the irregular thumping of his own heart. Then panic slammed into him. His breath caught as he stumbled backwards, almost slipping on the tiles, hands braced on the cold porcelain for support. The walls pressed in, cold and unfeeling as he tried to suck in deep gulps of air just to stay upright. The grotesque reality crashed over him, a crime scene right under his watch, one so gruesome that the lines between duty and genuine terror blurred in an instant. He fumbled for the radio at his hip, voice barely more than a rasp as he forced himself to speak, to string together words that made any kind of sense. The world suddenly seemed too loud, the echo of his footsteps as he backed out, the sharp buzz of the lights, the faint hum of the city continuing on as if nothing had changed. He slammed the restroom door shut behind him and leaned against the wall, sweat freezing on his forehead as the enormity of what he'd found threatened to crush him. After what felt like ages but could only have been seconds, Frank managed to call for help. His voice trembled, but he recounted what he'd seen: a bag, human remains, the construction zone on the 17th floor. He locked down the area as best he could, legs still trembling, forcing his mind to shift from shock to the steps he needed to take. When backup finally arrived, the sight in his eyes was enough to wordlessly convey the horrors within. From that moment, the building changed. The hallway outside that restroom seemed frozen in a new kind of silence. Not the quiet of early morning, but the hush of dread and disbelief. Frank's discovery ricocheted through every floor, sending whispers swirling and upending the comforting routines of Brookwood Tower. Nothing would ever feel routine again, not after this morning's ghastly unveiling. Initial investigation process. The initial investigation process in the aftermath of the grisly discovery set the stage for an intense, high-pressure effort inside and around Brookwood Tower. The New York Police Department arrived swiftly, their cruisers' red and blue lights swirling across the glass facade just before sunrise. Uniformed officers quickly cordoned off the building's main entrances, turning what had been a bustling Monday morning hub into an active crime scene surrounded by yellow caution tape and a growing crowd of curious onlookers. Inside, the building's tenants, startled, anxious, and whispering in clusters, were kept on the lower floors while the crime scene unit methodically worked the upper levels. A hush fell over the once noisy hallways. Crime scene investigators in white suits entered the restroom and the adjacent construction zone, documenting every inch with photos, video, and the systematic collection of evidence. The air was thick with a mix of fear, disbelief, and the sharp tang of industrial cleaners, now mixed with something much darker. Detective Angela Monroe, a rising star in the NYPD Homicide Division, led the investigative team. With a mix of authority and empathy, she briefed her squad, assigning them tasks, canvassing employees, interviewing building staff, and flagging anyone who'd been present early or late in the previous days. The forensics team meticulously cataloged the remains, which were identified as those of a young woman. No identification or personal belongings were immediately found near the body parts. No wallet, no phone, not even a name tag. Pathologists and forensic specialists worked rapidly under pressure. Preliminary autopsy findings suggested strangulation as the cause of death, with defensive wounds indicating a struggle. The victim's body had been dismembered using tools that matched those left by construction crews: saws, cutters, heavy-duty knives. A further chilling detail was the removal of a significant portion of tissue from the thigh, heightening the sense of perverse violence and pushing investigators to consider whether the killer had a background in anatomy or labor-intensive trades. DNA swabs and fingerprints were taken from the victim and the canvas bag, as well as every surface in the restroom and corridor that could yield a clue. In a stroke of luck and modern police work, a partial male DNA profile was developed from the remains and the inside of the bag, a flurry of hope in an otherwise bleak scene. Detectives huddled for hours in the hastily commandeered building manager's office, piecing together timelines, identifying gaps in the security log, and urgently requesting surveillance footage from the building's dozen cameras. Everyone who'd accessed the floors in question was flagged for questioning. Many tenants and staff, shaken by the sight of police and forensic vans, cooperated willingly, eager to contribute anything that might help. As rumors began to ripple outward onto the city's airwaves and morning news, the police understood the stakes had changed. This was not only a murder, but a public safety crisis in the making. The race against time, and a killer still at large, had officially begun. Identity of victims and suspects come under scrutiny. The identity of the victim quickly became the focus of the investigation, as every resource was marshaled to answer the city's burning question: who was she, and what had led to such a gruesome end within the walls of Brookwood Tower? Forensic teams worked tirelessly, combing through every trace of evidence. The victim's fingerprints, preserved on a fragment of shattered phone case found tucked in her coat pocket, provided the first real lead. Within hours, cross-checks with the national database yielded a match: Catherine Miller, age 28. She was a junior accountant on the 15th floor, known for her reserved nature and strong work ethic. Her supervisor described her as diligent, often staying late to finish spreadsheets or help colleagues behind schedule, while her friends remembered her as a kind soul with little drama in her life. Yet, as investigators soon learned, even quiet lives can run perilously close to unthinkable darkness. With Catherine's identity established, the Brookwood Tower security logs became an indispensable resource. Detectives pored over the entrance and exit records, looking for discrepancies in employee movement in the days surrounding the murder. Building surveillance footage was also painstakingly reviewed, frame by frame, for anything out of the ordinary. The focus quickly shifted to Jerry Milton, a night security guard whose name appeared frequently in the logs. Notably, Jerry had been the only guard on duty during the critical window when investigators believed the murder occurred. Jerry's routine, typically meticulous, showed gaps in his sign-in sheets during that night. Even more conspicuous was the fact that, after his scheduled shift, Jerry failed to show up for work again, and calls to his cell phone went unanswered. His sudden disappearance raised immediate red flags, fueling suspicion among the investigating officers. To build their case, police sought out colleagues and tenants who might have interacted with Jerry in the days before and after the murder. Interviews revealed that Jerry had seemed anxious and distracted the week leading up to the incident. One janitor recalled Jerry frantically borrowing money 2 days prior, mumbling something about an urgent crisis. Another coworker mentioned overhearing an argument between Jerry and an unseen caller outside the rear loading dock. Nothing about his past record suggested violence, but his odd behavior and abrupt absence now placed him squarely at the center of the investigation. Detectives secured a warrant and moved quickly to search Jerry's small apartment in Queens. They found the door locked from within, but an absence of recent activity suggested it hadn't been occupied in days. On entering, investigators discovered faint bloodstains on the bedroom rug and tiny flecks of dried material on Jerry's shoes in the closet, later matched by DNA analysis to Catherine Miller. Even more damning, a distinctive partial fingerprint found on the bag left at the crime scene was an exact match for Jerry's prints retrieved from his kitchen mug. With mounting forensic evidence and his unexplained disappearance, police were confident they had found their prime suspect. A citywide manhunt was declared, and Jerry Milton's name was released to the press, not just as a missing person, but as a suspect wanted for questioning in connection with one of the most chilling crimes Midtown had ever seen. Matching traces. The pursuit for answers intensified as investigators meticulously analyzed every trace of physical and circumstantial evidence left in the wake of the horrific crime. Task forces involving NYPD's forensics, local patrolmen, and even consulting crime lab experts from neighboring precincts were mobilized, each bringing their own expertise to the mounting pile of clues. The discoveries inside Jerry Milton's near-abandoned apartment became the linchpin to connect the fragmented pieces of the puzzle together. On the battered wooden floor, forensic teams photographed and cautiously collected tiny blood droplets found just beside Jerry's unmade bed. Initial chemical tests indicated a human origin, but the real breakthrough came when DNA analysis confirmed these stains matched the victim, Catherine Miller. This connection sent a powerful ripple through the case files, placing Catherine not only in direct contact with the suspect but also suggesting a frantic or possibly violent struggle had taken place within the cramped confines of Jerry's residence. In the closet, investigators found Jerry's worn work shoes with their darkened soles. Closer examination revealed minuscule flakes of material, strands from a plastic tarp matching those used at the crime scene, and faint traces of construction dust consistent with renovations on Brookwood Tower's 17th floor. Further, hidden beneath piles of dated receipts and scattered coins, a single latex glove was recovered. Inside, a partial fingerprint, later identified as Jerry's, provided the first solid forensics link between suspect scene and victim. But the most compelling evidence emerged from the canvas bag itself. Forensic scientists scoured every inch of its faded fabric, revealing not only hairs consistent with the victim, but also several shed fibers that matched a uniform worn by nighttime building security. Under ultraviolet light, faint smears of blood and a trace amount of skin cell residue were visible at the bag's seams. From these, a partial male DNA profile was successfully developed, later conclusively matched to Jerry Milton through a court-ordered saliva sample obtained from one of his old toothbrushes remaining in the apartment. Meanwhile, surveillance specialists combed footage retrieved from Brookwood Tower's camera system. Although the hallway camera near the construction zone had a blind spot, a separate camera, previously thought irrelevant, captured a shadowy figure resembling Jerry carrying a canvas bag during an unauthorized late-night trip to the 17th floor. While the image wasn't crystal clear, Jerry's distinctive gait and the unique scuff mark visible on his left shoe in the video became critical points of comparison. Adding to the mounting case, forensic analysts matched the type of industrial plastic wrap used to bundle the remains both to supplies ordered by the construction company. Records indicated Jerry had access to these materials when he helped offload shipment boxes just days before the crime. All throughout, the investigative team pieced together a timeline using electronic key logs and swipe card records. Jerry's digital footprint showed that he accessed the restricted floor during hours no authorized personnel should have been present, coinciding precisely with the estimated time of death provided by the medical examiner. His sudden absence from work and lack of contact with friends or family painted a portrait of a man on the run, desperately trying to stay ahead of the investigation. Neighbors reported seeing Jerry leave his apartment in a hurry, carrying what appeared to be stuffed duffel bags. Combined with forensic evidence and behavioral analysis, this testimony solidified the theory that Jerry had both motive and opportunity. Psychologists working with detectives began compiling a profile pointing to a perpetrator who operated with planning but left room for impulsivity and panic under stress. As the evidence converged from all avenues, biological, material, electronic, and eyewitness, authorities felt the noose tighten around Jerry Milton. The synergy of these matching clues left little doubt about his involvement, transforming scattered suspicions into a compelling, actionable case that would soon propel the investigation to a national manhunt. The troubled past of the perpetrator. Jerry Milton's story began in the quietly fading heartland of rural Ohio, where childhood should have offered endless fields, laughter, and safety. Born into a large, working-class family, The sixth child and the youngest son, he grew up in an atmosphere thick with frustration, unspoken tension, and the cyclical struggles of poverty. His father, a stoic machine operator at a local plant, ruled the home with the kind of rigid, reserved authority common to men who lost themselves in labor, while Jerry's mother drifted between exhaustion and bursts of affection. In Jerry's earliest years, he was known as a compliant, even timid child, a boy quick to fetch things, slow to anger, always seeking approval. But as the seasons churned and siblings grew up and out, Jerry's emotional environment soured. His memory of his parents grew sharper, more judgmental. Home was no longer a shield but a pressure cooker. He often retreated into books and lurked in the woods behind the house, developing a fascination with secrecy and withdrawn routines. It was during this period at 12 that Jerry stumbled upon a stash of adult magazines abandoned in an old barn. The imagery unsettled and intrigued him, sowing seeds of clandestine curiosity and unresolved shame that lingered far into his adolescence. What might have been a phase faded into something darker. His preteen years were marked by increasing episodes of isolation. He withdrew from school activities, friendships atrophied, and teachers described him in reports as either emotionally absent or prone to outbursts. Odd behaviors, locking himself in the garage for hours, mimicking adults in a parody of discipline and authority, hoarding trivial items, began to surface. With so many older siblings already stretching the parents' attention, Jerry's small rebellions went mostly unnoticed, or were chalked up to boy trouble. It wasn't until high school that these signs deepened into something more problematic. Jerry's first encounters with discipline were confusing for him. He craved structure but recoiled violently when criticized. A school psychologist noted his inward hostility and atypical emotional regulation, comments that went unaddressed at home. Jerry's alienation was camouflaged by the rough camaraderie of part-time jobs and the anonymity of teenage crowds, but inside, he simmered. As he grew older, petty theft and disturbing pranks offered illicit thrills, but any attempts at intervention by school officials fizzled as his family prepared him for adulthood with platitudes instead of guidance. By graduation, Jerry had cultivated a practiced indifference to the world, thinly masking a churning resentment. The modern world's pace left him feeling left out and invisible. Success stories on television seemed like cruel jokes. His sporadic attempts at connection, through church youth groups, short-lived friendships, and a disastrous first romance, only deepened his conviction that he was fundamentally different, apart. Early adulthood would soon reveal how dangerous this isolation, resentment, and unaddressed trauma could become. A soldier's life and the turning point of downfall. Jerry's journey into adulthood followed a path that many in small-town America view as a last hope for direction and stability: the military. In 1995, after a string of dead-end jobs and under increasing pressure from a father who interpreted discipline as salvation, Jerry enlisted in the Army. Although he hoped the uniform would grant him a sense of purpose and erase the lingering fog of resentment and inadequacy, what Jerry found instead was unrelenting regimentation and a constant struggle to fit in. Boot camp was a trial by fire. While other recruits bonded over shared hardship and military banter, Jerry's social inexperience and mounting anxiety isolated him. Drill sergeants misread his silence as stubbornness or defiance. Peers interpreted his awkwardness as arrogance. Jerry labored twice as hard to prove himself capable, but the praise for his technical skills rarely offset frequent demerits for insubordination or lack of team spirit. During deployments, Jerry's temperament only became more volatile. The rigid chain of command clashed with the emotional landmines he'd brought from childhood. He earned commendations in technical tasks, but several supervisors noted his tendency to lash out under stress. These lapses resulted in heated arguments, a bar fight that left him confined to quarters for 2 weeks and eventual demotion. Only the threat of a dishonorable discharge reined him in, temporarily. Outside of duty hours, Jerry battled loneliness and anger in silence. He failed to forge the supportive friendships that often sustain service members. A long-distance relationship with his high school sweetheart was his lone anchor, a flicker of hope that for a time kept him from spiraling. But the distance and Jerry's emotional volatility wore down the relationship, and a painful breakup after 4 years left him more adrift than ever. His final year in the Army marked a turning point. The structure that had once promised salvation now felt oppressive. Jerry's instability became more pronounced. He withdrew from group activities, let hygiene slip, and, in confidential counseling sessions, confessed to vivid nightmares and mounting rage. Military doctors suspected PTSD, but noted that symptoms long predated his service, a deeper psychological fault line tracing back to childhood trauma and chronic isolation. The end of Jerry's military career arrived not with ceremony, but with exhaustion. After a particularly explosive argument with a superior and a subsequent psychological evaluation, he was discharged under less than honorable conditions, officially citing persistent disciplinary issues and unsuitability for further service. He returned to civilian life embittered, his sense of failure compounded by shame and regret that he could neither name nor process. Yet, even in the wake of this personal nadir, no one in Jerry's orbit, family, former colleagues, or neighbors, fully grasped the gravity of the downward spiral underway. Outwardly, he was just another struggling veteran trying to find his footing, perhaps a bit quiet, perhaps a tad withdrawn, but nothing that set off alarm bells in communities all too familiar with stories of disappointment after war. Underneath, however, Jerry nursed a sense of betrayal and invisible wounds that quietly festered, setting the stage for ever darker thoughts as he drifted toward the margins of American society, entering the profession of protection and the eruption of criminal psychology. After being discharged from the Army and burdened by a growing sense of alienation, Jerry Milton drifted for months before finally landing in New York City, a place whose relentless pace and crowded anonymity seemed at first to offer him the obscurity he craved. With the meager savings left from his military benefits, he rented a cramped single-room apartment in Queens. In need of steady employment, he scanned the classifieds, eventually accepting a low-paying overnight security guard job at Madison Building, a dated office complex in Midtown. The transition from the structured chaos of military life to the monotonous solitude of security work proved jarring. Jerry's days became a monotonous cycle: sleep during the sunlight hours, microwave dinners at dusk, and the long, silent vigils of night shift patrols. His contact with others was superficial at best, from terse greetings at the start of shifts to quick silent walks through fluorescent-lit corridors. Still, the job provided strict routines and rules, something familiar, if not comforting. But the isolation and aimless repetition also provided fertile ground for Jerry's psychological turmoil to fester. Alone during endless rounds, he found his thoughts returning to old humiliations, resentments, and the sense of being an outsider in every community. Security footage from his rounds showed a man locked in habit, hardly interacting with tenants. His logbook was immaculate, entries dutifully recorded, yet fellow guards quietly described him as a ghost, present but somehow not truly there, always avoiding camaraderie, always haunted by his own silence. Over time, the boundaries between Jerry's fantasies and reality began to blur. He nursed grudges against co-workers who dismissed him, against tenants who treated him as invisible, and against the city that pressed in on all sides. Sometimes Jerry followed female employees a little too closely on their late-night walk to the parking garage, fueled by embittered curiosity and hidden fantasies of power. Once he was caught on camera lingering outside a young woman's office door, prompting a brief investigation and mandatory warning from management. He apologized, feigning confusion and fatigue, and the incident quietly faded, but he internalized it as further proof of his outsider status, deepening his paranoia and anger. His fascination with control and secrecy grew. Jerry began to carry a small notebook where he detailed imaginary scenarios, elaborate plans to outwit his colleagues, or twisted daydreams of retribution against those he perceived had wronged him. He kept meticulous files on building schedules, memorized camera angles, and cataloged which tenants stayed late or worked alone. All the while, the line between passive observation and predatory intent was thinning. It was during these long, lonely hours that Jerry's fixation on the tenants, especially female workers with predictable routines, intensified into obsession. In the quiet of the graveyard shift, he would imagine alternate lives, projecting his insecurities onto others and feeding a delusional belief that he was not merely ignored, but actively persecuted by the world around him. Jerry's fantasies, once mere coping mechanisms, began morphing into dark, intrusive thoughts of exerting control and instilling fear. Jerry's psychological descent manifested in small but unmistakable ways. He tampered with office locks, rearranged items on desks, and moved security camera angles for reasons nobody could decipher. He found twisted satisfaction watching the subtle confusion such minor disruptions caused when the victims returned in the morning, an invisible hand sowing chaos, a shadow behind the scenes. But the thrill of these anonymous acts of interference quickly proved insufficient. Around this time, another security breach rattled the building, unrelated to Jerry, but enough to stoke fears and force management to review safety protocols. For Jerry, it was a perverse form of validation. In the renewed sense of unease, he felt an ironic kinship with the pulse of the building, his own simmering instability reflected in the anxious energies of others. He began to nurture the idea that he could do something truly unforgettable, something that would prove, once and for all, that he was more than an invisible cog. As he lurked in his booth, scanning entry logs and camera feeds, Jerry's fantasies started taking on the contours of something actionable, methodical, and sinister. He carefully selected targets, with Catherine Miller, an unassuming junior accountant with a reliable routine, eventually capturing his focus. Jerry observed her for weeks, her habits, her late hours, her routes through the building. Where others saw nothing, Jerry constructed intricate narratives of rejection and challenge. His dark obsession crystallized, with every passing shift drawing him closer to enacting the twisted desires that now dominated his increasingly fractured mind. Unbeknownst to his colleagues, and entirely unsuspected by his few remaining acquaintances outside work, Jerry had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The facade of normalcy, the neat uniform, the polite nods, remained in place, but behind it, an intricate, dangerous web had been spun, and the psychological groundwork for violence was complete. Murder and challenging letters. After committing the chilling crime that shattered the veneer of security at Brookwood Tower, Jerry Milton entered a phase that criminal psychologists often characterize as both compulsive and calculated. He didn't flee in blind panic, instead his departure was methodically orchestrated. Surveillance footage would later reveal Jerry moving through the building's service corridors with eerie composure, his actions devoid of visible haste, as if resolved to leave behind not just a corpse but a challenge to all who sought justice. In the days following the crime, Jerry cut off all immediate ties. He disposed of his uniform and altered his appearance using cheap hair dye and a hastily grown beard. Leaving bills and scattered personal effects behind in his apartment was inadvertent, evidence of a mind on the cusp of collapse, yet still cunning enough to elude an immediate arrest. He left his phone behind, never to be turned on again, signaling an understanding of police tracking methods. Jerry had spent enough years watching security procedures to know how the system works, and more tellingly, how to slip through its cracks. But most disturbing was what arrived at the NYPD Homicide Division headquarters 3 days later, an envelope, postmarked from a nondescript town hundreds of miles away. Inside, detectives found a letter, typed, explicit, and taunting. Jerry, though not signing his name, filled the letter with intimate details of the crime scene, the precise arrangement of the remains, the time windows that only someone inside would know, and a string of cryptic references to police procedures. He challenged officers to find the phantom hiding among your own shadows. For law enforcement and the media, this changed the case's tone. The act was no longer just a murder. The city now faced a cunning adversary who seemed to derive pleasure from the investigation itself. Over the following weeks and months, more letters followed, each from a different postmark. These missives ranged in tone from chillingly clinical recitations of forensic details to grandiose philosophical statements about social invisibility, control, and power over life and death. Jerry taunted authorities for their perceived incompetence, hinting at a higher purpose behind his crimes, painting himself as a misunderstood outsider forced into darkness by the world's indifference. Each letter was meticulously handled by the FBI's behavioral and linguistic experts. Patterns in language, word choice, and obscure references slowly mapped out Jerry's psychology. The sadistic detail, the quest for recognition, and the clear delight in outsmarting the authorities all pointed not just to a desperate fugitive, but to a mind intoxicated by its sense of mastery and the spectacle of the chase. Several letters included warnings suggesting he might not be done yet, leaving both investigators and the public in a state of simmering tension. What Jerry wanted, above all, was to feel seen. Each challenge he mailed was a cry for acknowledgement, the same attention he'd felt denied in his earlier life. But instead of seeking reconciliation, he wielded his crimes as a weapon, daring society to catch the man in their midst. What started as an act of violence became an ongoing psychological duel, a cat-and-mouse game that would haunt the NYPD and the nation for years to come. A series of crimes continues across the United States. In the months and years following his original crime at Brookwood Tower, Jerry Milton's presence seemed to slither through the cracks of America's vast metropolitan landscape. His methods evolved, Yet the signature brutality and taunting remained disturbingly consistent. With each passing city, the press and the police unwittingly tracked the path of a man both methodical and compulsive, leaving anxious communities in his wake, from the rain-soaked streets of Pittsburgh to the neon-lit sprawl of Las Vegas. Reports of unsolved homicides began to accumulate, each case echoing elements that by then were chillingly familiar to the authorities who had studied the Brookwood murder. Victims, almost always female professionals working late shifts or keeping strict routines, were discovered in secluded office buildings or vacant construction zones. The scenes were marked by a level of forensic precision, dismembered remains carefully concealed, evidence of physical struggle, and the use of ordinary materials like construction plastic and canvas bags to shroud the crimes. In several cases, investigative teams noticed post-mortem arrangements that appeared symbolic, as if Jerry wanted the authorities to read meaning into the horror he left behind. What united these disparate cases, besides the perpetrator's distinctive methodology, were the letters. After each new crime, local law enforcement, and eventually, federal authorities, received envelopes containing typed notes. The content of these missives varied from mocking descriptions of police response to philosophical ruminations about invisibility, fate, and power. Jerry's taunts grew bolder as his exploits became a media circus. With every letter, he elevated his own mythos, positioning himself not as an anonymous criminal but as a dark author of fear, a phantom, who understood society's blind spots and delighted in exposing them. Each new city brought its own investigation, its own flash of panic, and its own frustrated press conferences. Local journalists described the mounting sense of dread as the so-called shadow watchman, haunted late-night news cycles. Behavioral analysts with the FBI began cross-referencing the details, the timeline of the murders, forensic parallels, and, most crucially, the signatures embedded in Jerry's letters. With passing months, a multi-state task force was assembled, sharing information across jurisdictional boundaries in hopes of anticipating Jerry's next move. Jerry's uncanny ability to evade capture, even as forensic science improved and nationwide databases expanded, fueled not just fear, but a kind of dark curiosity. Amateur sleuths on internet forums spun wild theories, inadvertently feeding the narrative Jerry tried so hard to construct. Most disturbing to investigators was the sense that the killer adapted with each crime, learning from every close call and adjusting his strategies. In Cleveland, he switched methods and left almost no physical evidence, an implicit dare to detectives. In Chicago, he left a cryptic map folded inside his letter that led the authorities on a wild chase before finally discovering the victim's body. The fact that he seemed to be orchestrating a deadly game only deepened the sense of horror shared by both law enforcement and the public. Despite the climate of panic, there were also false alarms and near misses. In Las Vegas, a suspected copycat attack raised doubts, but Jerry's signature letter arrived within days, clarifying the boundaries between authentic crimes and mere imitations. Each time, his correspondence became more elaborate, referencing newspaper articles and even televised police appeals. The killer followed the coverage of his own spree closely, responding with chilling precision to investigators' public statements. Communities nationwide were forced to revisit the fundamentals of workplace safety and security protocols. Corporations overhauled late-night access policies. Police launched public awareness campaigns, and private security companies saw a surge in demand. Even as these measures were enacted, there was a prevailing anxiety that anyone could be the next target. Federal agents, under immense scrutiny and pressure, worked through mountains of tips while tracking the intricate trail Jerry left behind. As his crimes rippled outward, Jerry, in a perverse way, seemed attuned to the mounting fear across the country. He adapted his routine to slip through the cracks in overlapping jurisdictions and hide within the anonymity of transient city life. While law enforcement coordinated multi-state stakeouts and developed complex offender profiles, Jerry utilized skills honed both in the military and during his isolated years as a security guard. False identification, burner phones, altered appearance, and an almost monastic discipline allowed him to vanish just as the net was tightening. Some letters revealed glimpses of Jerry's distorted motivations, suggesting he saw his actions as a form of ultimate recognition, a perverse way to write himself into history by forcing the world to reckon with his existence. At times the tone was almost apologetic, as if he half acknowledged the pain caused. More often his words were icy, manipulative, and calculated to simultaneously inflame and confound the professionals hunting him. Each message fueled media speculation, further enmeshing Jerry's persona in American true crime lore. The psychological toll on communities was significant. Office workers nationwide grappled with anxiety and suspicion, especially those working alone after hours. Some victims' families, devastated and frustrated by the lack of closure, banded together to press authorities for greater transparency and urgency. Meanwhile, the criminal justice system faced growing criticism for its inability to quickly apprehend the killer, especially as it became clear that Jerry was evading not only city police, but also federal agents. By the second year of the spree, a sketch of Jerry, assembled from limited CCTV footage, eyewitness reports, and forensic artistry, circulated widely. The FBI dedicated a special unit collaborating with psychological profilers, forensic analysts, and cybercrime experts. National television programs broadcast Jerry's suspected movements, and his crimes inspired countless podcasts and investigative specials. Yet every time a significant lead seemed to emerge, Jerry had already faded into the background, leaving only his next macabre calling card behind. His long string of crimes ultimately shifted the national conversation about the nature of criminal investigation, the dangers of modern anonymity, and the limits of existing surveillance state infrastructure. Jerry's unprecedented ability to blend in while committing brazen acts of violence and psychological warfare left a mark far beyond his immediate victims, seeding unease about the fragility of safety in daily American life. As communities, families, and agencies joined forces in the face of an ever-evolving threat, the chilling challenge remained, catching a killer who seemed to know both his own darkness and everyone else's blind spots better than anyone in pursuit. Vast skies of heaven. By the spring of 2004, the hunt for Jerry Milton had become one of the largest multi-agency manhunts in recent American criminal history. For nearly 5 years, Jerry had managed to evade capture, changing identities, states, and superficial habits, always seeming to stay one step ahead of the authorities. But as with so many relentless pursuits, a pattern began to emerge out of chaos, allowing the net to tighten around him inexorably. The first true lead came not from forensic breakthroughs or high-tech surveillance, but from the patient, old-fashioned work of law enforcement officers who never gave up. A junior postal worker in a suburb outside Houston noticed a string of irregular mailings, packages sent from suspicious motels and roadside stops bearing similar handwriting and odd, minimalist return addresses. FBI analysts, already on high alert for new clues, cross-referenced this with the envelope postmarks from Jerry's taunting letters. Every little piece of the puzzle finally clicked into place. With renewed urgency, a task force comprised of local Houston detectives, the FBI and U.S. Marshals began an intensive investigation into transient motels and short-term rentals on the city's periphery. Undercover officers posed as maintenance workers, delivery drivers, and even drifters, steadily narrowing their focus. Digital breadcrumbs, credit card transactions under various aliases Jerry had adopted, burner phone registrations, and even CCTV footage from a nondescript gas station revealed a new routine. For the first time, authorities were not just reacting to Jerry's next move, they had anticipated it. The operation to apprehend him was a model of coordination, secrecy, and patience. They didn't want a standoff or a hostage crisis. They wanted Jerry alive, to answer for his crimes and, if possible, to prevent another macabre chapter. On an overcast afternoon just outside Houston, a heavily armed SWAT team surrounded one of the budget motels flagged as a likely hiding spot. Jerry, already isolated and running out of resources, barely had time to react before the door was breached and law enforcement flooded inside. The man who had once controlled the fear of a nation was finally subdued, surrendered among takeout boxes and a suitcase packed with maps, burner phones, and meticulously kept notes on police response patterns. The arrest reverberated across the country. Jerry was transported under heavy guard, his every movement documented and analyzed for potential escape attempts or further revelations. The search of his temporary quarters uncovered chilling reminders of his years on the run, a cache of fake IDs, torn news clippings about his crimes, coded notes, and the tools of his gruesome craft. Most telling were dozens of notebooks, packed with obsessive entries, references to his crimes, speculative plans for future attacks, elaborate musings on justice and power, and frequent diatribes against the world that had, in his mind, shunned him. Jerry's interrogation was, as expected, difficult and psychologically fraught. Facing seasoned FBI profilers and homicide detectives, he vacillated between stone-cold silence and rambling self-justification. He was clinically polite, still carrying the bearing of a man who believed himself the center of a spectacle. When pressed with details only the killer could know, Jerry offered chilling admissions, correcting investigators on minor points, delighting in reminding them where they had come closest and where they still misunderstood him. The trial unfolded under the relentless scrutiny of national and international media. Jerry's defense team, cobbled together through court appointments and his own cryptic demands, tried to plead diminished capacity, introducing expert testimony regarding his long-standing psychological disorders, isolation, and trauma. The prosecution, however, countered with the depth and breadth of evidence. Forensic proof connecting him to each crime, a flood of eyewitness accounts, and, most damning, the very letters Jerry had sent taunting his pursuers. These were read aloud in a hushed courtroom, their tone and details matching the macabre choreography that had terrified the nation for years. For the public, the spectacle was cathartic, but sobering. Victims' families sat through days of testimony, reliving the pain with each new revelation. The jury, exposed to months of evidence and argument, found Jerry guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase was emotionally raw, as prosecutors detailed the devastation Jerry had caused, while defense experts continued to urge mercy based on his mental health history. In the end, the need for closure and justice prevailed. Jerry was sentenced to death, the final chapter in a saga that revealed as much about the darkness of one mind as it did about the resilience and dogged determination of many others. Media analysis of the case lingered for years. Debates raged over the effectiveness of interagency coordination, ethical questions around capital punishment, and the limits of profiling a killer so skilled at eroding digital and physical traces. For those who had been swept up in the panic, the outcome brought relief, but also a sense of sobering vulnerability. New protocols were implemented across businesses and law enforcement on how to handle high-profile fugitives and the psychological warfare of taunting communications. Looking back, Jerry Milton's capture did not erase the wounds he had inflicted, nor did it undo the fear that seeped into late-night offices and quiet apartment complexes across the country. Still, his arrest and conviction became a symbol, the proof that, no matter how vast the country or how cunning the adversary, persistence and cooperation could prevail. In the end, the net closed not with a sudden stroke of genius, but through the collected patience, doggedness, and refusal to let evil disappear quietly into the night.